Welcome to the Earth's Edge podcast. I'm your host, James McManus. At Earth's Edge, we run guided expeditions with a focus on environmental and cultural sustainability. We created this podcast to share stories from people who have found the outdoors and fallen in love with adventure. Each month, we're giving away one of our summit jackets worth €150. To be in the running, all you need to do is subscribe to our mailing list at earths-edge.com/podcast. There's a link in the show notes. Now, for today's guest.
We all were involved in it, and I think you learned on those trips how to be responsible for everybody and wait for everybody and look after everybody. If we hit a little bit of white water, you waited and the others waited until everybody came through.
That was the Earth's Edge medical director and my dad, George McManus. It took me ages to get him on the podcast, but I'm glad I did, as he's a key part of the team at Earth's Edge. He provides 24/7 phone support for all of our expedition doctors working throughout the world. We chat about how we got into the outdoors, his medical career, the impact my mum had on our lives, and his experience on Kilimanjaro. Hope you guys enjoy it. So George, the two of us have been trekking all over the world with Earth's Edge, and I know yourself and my mum Libby, you did a ton of stuff together prior to me setting up the business in 2007. But what I want to talk to you about starting off is your childhood, and really, did you go on any adventures growing up as a kid? You were born in Athlone in the west of Ireland in 1946 in a little village called Currahaleen outside Athlone. What was that like?
Sure, it was a different world back then. I can remember back, I started national school in 1951. And I remember it was about 2 miles from our house. And when you come home the evening time, you'd have loads of jobs to be doing. You'd looking after animals, picking potatoes, things like that. And it was a very Catholic, traditional house. There was a Sacred Heart lamp burning in the kitchen all the time. I served mass on a Sunday. So we were always busy and we were never short of anything. But you just did the jobs on the small farm and it was expected of you to do them. There was no such a thing as paying your pocket money or anything like that.
Yeah, you were just free labour. Like, sure, you took advantage of me in the same way, you know, with my childhood, like.
Looking back at it now, it sounds harsh, but we didn't know any better and we were happy doing things like that. But there was, I suppose, where I got my work ethic. I was just working all the time. We were never short of jobs. We'd be doing more at the weekends, and then in summertime it'd be saving turf, making hay, fixing fences and hanging gates and siding thistles and pure hardship.
And you didn't have electricity growing up, no?
It came in 1956 when I was 10.
Okay.
Now, that made a huge difference. It kind of got rid of pookies and banshees and it lightened up the countryside. So it made a big difference. But I remember about the house, the only warm room in the house was the kitchen, where we had a Stanley range, where we burned turf. But every other room in the house was absolutely iceberg.
I know, yeah. Jesus, I tell you, we're gone soft these days. Like, you were tough back then.
But we had the best of food. My mother used to bring a couple of dozen eggs into the local grocer in Clone on a Saturday. And in exchange, she bought flour and tea.
Yeah.
And we had everything else. We had milk, eggs, fowl, lambs, chickens, our own butter. They were the only things we needed to buy. So it was a kind of a barter system.
It sounds very romantic, doesn't it? Like, there's a lot of people now who are trying to rewild land and want to get back to the land and become more woke. Like, what would you've lived that life. Would you recommend it? You know, living off the grid and all this kind of stuff. Like, it's a romantic notion, but it's tough as well, isn't it?
No, it is tough. It's especially tough back then, because you're talking about the horse and plough. We didn't have a tractor.
Yeah, it's mad.
And it was just manual labour. And look, and we did it. It was the thing. Most people worked from morning till dusk. And that was it. Everybody else was doing it. So it was normal. We didn't know any better.
And like, you're the hardest working person I've ever met in my life. Like, where did you learn that ethic? Like,
Also learned it at home. I mean, you were never short of a job on the farm, especially at the weekends and irrespective of what time of the year. It was a mixed farm and it was all over the place. We spent a lot of time driving animals. We had 30 acres in one place and 10 miles down the road we had 2 acres. And you sleep well at night, I'll tell you that.
There's a lot of listeners probably from Meath or South Tipperary where there's good land, but I've actually been over a few times visiting your home place, and it's more rocks than there is grass in the place. Like it was tough going. You had little small holdings here and there, but did you go on many adventures growing up? Like you had 2 brothers and a sister. Did you go off and adventuring at all, or were you just working all the time?
We went on our holidays to Salt Hill every year.
Yeah.
That was very unusual. We were the only people in the village that went on holiday. And I remember a big deal. We went down to Shannon Airport one night. And we went down when it was dark. And there was nothing happening.
Yeah.
And the only other thing I can remember is going from Athlone by steam engine to climb Croagh Patrick on Pilgrim Sunday in July.
In your bare feet?
Steam engine. I know we had shoes now.
I'm only messing with you.
But at those times, James, I wore hand-me-downs.
Yeah, big time.
Clothes or shoes from my older brother. I was glad to have them.
Yeah. You've been trekking in probably over 30 countries around the world. Like, did you have that thirst to travel growing up? I know you had an uncle who joined the Royal Air Force and was eventually shot down in the Second World War over in Munich. And you also told me about an aunt of yours that moved to London who was a nurse and ended up caring for the director of an investment fund. And as he got more sick, she took over the business from him, learned how to trade stocks, and ended up dying in the late 80s with an estate worth 30 million sterling. Like, that's mental stuff. Like, so did you always have a passion for travel, or what way were you growing up like?
Well, my mother's brother, he left the farm in North Roscommon when he was about 17. I think he just was fed up at home, and as you would be at that age, and he joined the RAF. And he was shot down over in Munich in 1944.
Yeah.
My mother's sister then, she trained as a nurse, and she went to London. And she got involved in private nursing, and she was nursing this man who owned a company, and he was into stocks and shares. This woman was very bright. So she kind of learned how to dabble in stocks and shares, and eventually she moved up the company, and she had a huge Rolls-Royce company car. And she did leave 30 million in the end, but she left it in a trust.
She didn't leave any of the 30 million to you?
Well, to be fair to her now, between all her nieces and nephews, 2 years before she died, she left us all 3,000 sterling each.
Wow. There's a lot back then.
But she left this other money in a trust, and some reporter in one of the rag papers got a hold of it, and they interviewed Owen, and Owen, of course, my older brother, he denied all knowledge of it.
Say nothing. Yeah, good man.
But we saw none of the 30 million, but it was invested in a trust over there. But she became more English than the English people. She reminded me of Margaret Thatcher. She was very grand and had fur coats.
And she grew up in a little village in Roscommon, like.
Yeah.
That's mad,
but she did well for herself. So she was very bright.
George, did you always want to study medicine?
No, I hadn't a clue. I did my leaving search when I was 17 and 3 or 4 months.
Okay.
Now, we came from a very traditional family. 2 of my aunts were nuns. 4 of my uncles were doctors. 3 of my aunts were doctors. And 2 of my uncles were priests. So my mother, being a traditional Irish family, she decided the eldest boy would go for the priesthood.
Yeah.
And then she suggested to me that I should try medicine. I had no clue what I wanted to do, so I said, fine, she would go along with it, see what it's like. And then the youngest boy would inherit the farm.
Yeah.
And my only sister, she would get a good education, and hopefully, my mother would say, she'd marry well.
Yeah, get rid. It's mad, isn't it? Like, I can imagine saying that to it's just times have changed. Change for the better, like, I mean, yeah.
So that was my vocation. I didn't have it. My mother had a vocation for my older brother and myself, but thankfully it worked out for me, and I loved every minute of it.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about studying. You went to Dublin when you were 17 to study medicine in UCD, and like, I just think it's mad. I remember you telling me before you went to Dublin for the first time when you were 16 on a school tour. And then like a generation later, like when you compare that to my life, like I went to Kenya to visit cousins of ours when I was 9 and we climbed Mount Kenya. And you went to Dublin for the first time when you were 16. It's just mental the change. Like, but how was that? How was the experience of living in the big smoke? Like, did you like it?
That was tough. Like there were 252 people in my year. And I was from rural Ireland, and basically I was living in accommodation. There were no such thing as apartments then. I mean, there were flats. They were dingy, and the first 2.5 years wasn't nice. It was only after that, when I was exposed to the hospital system, that it became more interesting, and really I gelled in very well. But the first 2 or 3 years were tough enough. Yeah. I mean, we were studying things like zoology and biology. It's nonsense. We never needed it.
Yeah, I can't see you using zoology much as a GP, you know. But
well, the present system now that they have in Limerick is the best system. Have your primary degree, and then you go into medical school as a postgraduate in Limerick, and you do your 4 years. There's no need for the 6 years that I did.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, George, you qualified then in 1969 and you went to intern in the States in Virginia in a military hospital over there. Is that right, yeah?
As a student in 5th Med, we all went to America to sample. So I went to Michigan for the summer.
Okay.
And I really liked the system over there. And then I interned in Norfolk, Virginia. Now, that was something else because Norfolk was the naval base of the Mediterranean fleet for the Americans.
Okay.
And when I went out there, they put me on the emergency room for the first month, 7 in the morning to 7 in the evening, 6 days a week.
Yeah.
And it was mental. It was the time, it was that very month, July 1969, that Neil Armstrong landed on the moon.
Mad.
And I have no recollection of it because it was a huge thing in America, but I was so stressed out, if you like, because I hadn't enough of... I was green coming out of college. And the American guys, all the American house staff were 3 years older than me. They all had what we have in Limerick now. They all had their primary degrees and then they went into medical school. Okay. So when I was 23, they were 27, 28.
Right, okay, yeah.
But it was a fast learning curve.
Yeah.
And I learned very fast. And it was a different concept. I'd be examining a patient and I'd say it around, such a guy has a 2-finger enlarged liver. And they'd say, well, you cut out that nonsense. We do blood tests and scans out here.
Yeah.
There's no need for that kind of, or has he a systolic murmur or a diastolic murmur.
George, did you enjoy your time off while you were there? I know you had a Ford Mustang. You that's a fairly decent car. You must have been a bit of a player, were you, in your time off? Like.
Well, I had a girlfriend out there, I think her name was Clarissa.
Okay.
So it was very nice. It was so hot in the summertime. Now, I, like yourself, have red hair and the sun doesn't agree with me.
Yeah, I know.
So I went to Virginia Beach, which is a fairly famous beach, but it was so hot. Even the sand would burn the sole off your foot.
So listen, you spent 3 years out there, you got some experience, and you came back to Ireland in 1972 and you set up practice as a GP in Roscrea. What was that like? Tell me about that.
Well, sure, Roscrea needed a doctor and I was glad to set up there, and it was love at first sight. I loved the people from the word go and I think they liked me. But it was difficult. I mean, the main trouble I had, I was 25 driving a Ford Capri, which was a kind of a fancy car.
Yeah.
And I just bought a house. And the biggest problem I had, I needed somebody to help me. Now, while all the priests in the parish had a housekeeper, I needed somebody, but I couldn't possibly have a female in the house with me. So I put an ad in the local paper looking for a butler. And I got one reply from a Michael Noonan. He was working with a retired bank manager up in Eden who was a widow. And he remarried, and the new woman threw him out.
Oh, okay.
So he just came along to me, and he suited me fine. He answered the door, answered the phone. And I was glad to have him. He was a bit of a religious fanatic and he didn't know how to cook really, but look at, I was glad to have him. And I was a marked man then. I mean, when you're a young doctor in the town and driving a car, I mean, I was under pressure to get married. And, wouldn't you think that guy would be married, and he having everything going for him?
Maybe there were, there was, that said, you were talking the town. The reason you had a butler was because of the hours you were working. So you were working every day, 8 to 6 in the practice. Then you were on call every second night and you did every second weekend working as well. And you didn't really take any holidays. That's absolutely mental, like, when you think about it.
Well, as well as that, I did 4 night surgeries between 7 and 9.
Wow.
But you're going back to times where most doctors in small towns never met each other. They probably didn't even talk to each other.
Yeah.
It was only from the time I started, particularly when I got a new partner and other younger doctors, that we began to socialise together and we set up rotas. But in the beginning, I was on every night. And then I was very lucky to get a very good partner in the early 1980s, Pauline Defoe. She always was and is a very good doctor. And she was most helpful. And she was a brilliant partner for me in the 1980s and 1990s. So that gave me a better rota, more time off and this type of thing. But in the beginning, it was very hard. But then everybody else was working just as hard. It was the thing you did.
So guys, I just want to bring Ariana in there to chat about our big announcement last week. Ariana, what's the crack?
Hi James, thanks for having me on the podcast, and a big hello to all our lovely listeners. So, you may have already seen that we have recently become a certified B Corp. This is something that we have been working towards for quite some time now, so it's a huge achievement and one that we are incredibly proud of. The fact that we are the highest scoring Irish B Corp is an absolute honour and something we are beyond delighted with. Being B Corp certified, we're joining a community of over 3,700 other amazing companies throughout the world who are doing the utmost for their staff, customers and communities, all the while minimising their environmental impact.
This is savage. I'm so excited about this. It's such a special moment for all of us. So tell me this, what exactly is B Corp? It's like a fair trade certification, right?
It's very similar. So many people want to know where their food comes from and if it's sustainably sourced or if our clothes are ethically manufactured. So we thought, well, our clients should know more about the company they're travelling with. To put it simply, the B Corp status recognises businesses that balance purpose with profit, putting environmental and social responsibilities to the forefront of how they operate. B Corps are committed to using business as a force for good, ensuring they are actively benefiting the planet and our communities through sustainable business practices and creating environmental awareness. So, over the next number of weeks, I'll be jumping on the podcast to tell you more about what B Corp is, how the assessment works, what it means for our staff and customers, and our existing and future community and environmental projects.
Sounds great, Ariana. We'll chat to you next week.
Cool. Thanks, James. Chat soon.
So, George, when you were about 28, you met my mum, Libby, and things started to go downhill pretty rapid then. She had a massive impact in your life. Like, she was an amazing woman, really, when you think of it, like.
Oh, she was very bright. She was able to multitask. That was the main thing.
Yeah.
And she was very involved and very type A personality and very assertive. And basically, I wanted to keep the butler. I was looking for a premises down in Rosemary Square and she was in a flat upstairs. So when I met her, she suddenly told me then that premises was for sale. So I bought it. The joke at the time was that I had to buy her as well. She came with the premises. But anyway, I went very hard on her to keep the butler. He could stay in a flat on top of the surgery downtown. And she said, no way. So she said, it's either herself or the butler. One of us have to go.
Yeah.
And for the second time, then poor Michael Noonan was let go. He was coming up the road one evening from the town and he met a neighbour of mine. And he said to her, I was in with the doctor today and I have blood pressure. And he said, the doctor across the road, he's a nice man, but that bloody woman.
So then we came along. You had 4 children, my older brother and sister Ed and Claire, and then me and my younger sister Kate. I want to ask you about that, George. Kate was my younger sister. She died of cot death when she was 9 months old in 1985. I was 2, Claire was 4 and Ed was 6. it was a very tough time for you and Libby, and something that always sticks to my mind is that because of your work circumstances, like you had to go back to work the day after her funeral. Those are different times, like, talk to me about that.
When I came home from work one Tuesday evening around 5 o'clock, my wife's aunt was staying with us at the time, and I said, "Where's Kate?" "Oh, she's still asleep upstairs." And I said, "Oh, go up and get her up. We won't sleep a wink tonight." So my wife's aunt went up for her. And the minute she came in the door, she looked white as a ghost.
Fuck.
So we tried to resuscitate her. And basically, my partner was in holidays in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Another doctor in the town was holidays in Donegal. This was a Tuesday evening, so we brought her to the church and buried her on the Wednesday.
Fuck.
And I had no alternative then but to go back to work on the Thursday. So when you look back on it, it's unreal, but I've learned from it. One thing I learned anytime I dealt with a death was, I said to the people, the family, don't rush the funeral.
Yeah.
Take your time. Take 3 or 4 days. You need to grieve, you need time. So I learned from that. And it had consequences for Libby as well. Not for the first time she changed her career. We became involved in the Cot Death Association. She went to Clonwilliam Institute to train as a family therapist. But it had a huge effect on us, particularly Libby. I really hadn't bonded with Kate.
Yeah.
Libby had breastfed her, and I don't think Kate realised that I was in the house.
Yeah.
But it had a much bigger effect on Libby than myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a different way of dealing with things. I think as men a lot, we tend to kind of compartmentalize things and push things down. And so, but I understand your perspective. But like, there were different times, George, when you think about it like that. I don't think something like that would happen now where you'd be straight back to work the next day. You'd have different support.
When I went back to work, like most people didn't even mention it.
Yeah.
As most men wouldn't know what to say to you.
No.
And a lot of them hadn't realised it happened because it all happened so suddenly.
Yeah.
But like they didn't mention it when they were in with me, and I certainly didn't want to burden them with my own problems. But it happened, and look, it was nobody's fault. Cot death, it's the same nowadays, it happens. No reason for it, but it's tough. Two things I learned when you go into a house and there's a cot death, first thing you do is you find out the name of the baby.
Yeah.
Would say it's Siobhan. So you talk about Siobhan to the family, Siobhan this, Siobhan that, and you don't say you have an angel in heaven. It's the last thing you need to say.
And that's what was said to you back then, was it?
Yeah, you have an angel in heaven. Libby would say, I don't want an angel in heaven, I want a child on earth.
Yeah.
So subsequently, when the cot death happens, you have to call the guards. So you can imagine young guards going into a house. But Libby did lecture the guards for several years free on cot death and how to manage it and what to do. So some good things.
She got really involved in that, and I know and it kind of really motivated her to help out with that, and also train to become a family therapist and help other families out with bereavement. That was very good of her at the time. When you think back, that was 1985. Society in Ireland has changed a huge amount in that time. Like, we've had the marriage referendum, we've had repeal the 8th. And like, I wanted to chat to you, like in the last couple of weeks, we had that recent report on the mother and baby homes in Ireland, which is a real open wound for us in Ireland. And a lot of countries have a checkered history, I guess, or I don't know what the phrase is, but I remember you telling me before things like contraception and the morning after pill were legal in Ireland, you were helping young women out with that. Can you share some of that? Obviously, you've got a doctor-patient confidentiality there, but just talk to me about that time. Like, what was it like practicing medicine then in that context?
Well, the mother and baby home in Rossbray closed down in 1969, and I started in 1972.
Yeah.
Back then, it was a very conservative country.
Yeah.
And nobody mentioned anything about St. Anne's when I was down there. It was all hush-hush.
Yeah.
So gradually things improved then, and the morning after the ordinary pill became available and the intrauterine contraceptive devices became available. And the way I looked at it when somebody was in with me, It was a private setup, and the patient's welfare was number one, and the law and the church were way down the list. I did what was best for them, and once the pill became available, I prescribed it, and once my IUDs became available, I inserted some of them. So I had no difficulty with that. And I helped out, but the patient was number one, and she was number one.
Yeah.
I wasn't too worried about the law or what the church said, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Come on. Let's get back to talking about adventures. So my mum was really the inspiration for us all to get into the outdoors and going hiking. And one of the things I've inherited from her is that I always design itineraries like that are too hard, and I end up doing them once, like with Earth's Edge, and then having to make it easier. I think that's something I learned from her. Like, I remember one of the first adventures I remember going on was up in the Slieve Blooms, which are the mountains close by us here, are in Tip. Like, there was us and family friends of ours from Dublin, and I must have been around 5 at the time, and she decided to do this mad hike across the top of the Slieve Blooms, and it was full of heather, like high heather. So I was only up to about your knee. So every step it was like I had to step over a high fence, and we were absolutely bollocks after it. Do you remember that, yeah?
I remember it well. Well, she was very adventurous, but she always overestimated her ability and other people's abilities. So we were usually struggling at the end of the hike. And even though she had a compass and everything, but she was great organised. She did all that organising, and we went up the Devil's Base and the Slieve Blooms, and it was very adventurous, and I think she gave you the taste for doing that kind of thing.
Absolutely, yeah. I remember that trip. I was the same one there when there was some mix up of where the food was going to be, and we eventually got to the car, and there was a couple of roastery chickens in the car, and we absolutely devoured it. Like, we nearly ate the bones and everything. We were so hungry, like. So it was funny, like. But another thing, like, obviously growing up, is, you remember, like, kayaking was a huge part of my life. I represented Ireland as a kayaker and travelled all over the world with it. But back in the early days, like, we all learned to kayak together. And I remember, I was just thinking of this, like, you had to learn how to swim, because obviously growing up in rural Ireland, there was no swimming pools around in your time. Like, so you had to learn in your early 40s. And then about, when I was starting kayaking, you must have been, it's 30 years ago, so you must have been around 45. I'll never forget the day myself, yourself, and my older brother Ed, we went out kayaking on the Brosna, and like, we were in the water about a minute, and both you and he were in the water, like, swimming, and you were freaking out. You thought you were going to drown, and I couldn't help you because it was so small. Like, the kayaks back then, they were 4 meters long. When they got full of water, they'd take about 400 liters of water. Like, there was no way I was pulling one of them out of the water, but the two of you let yourselves down badly. It was a funny event. Like, do you remember that? Yeah,
I do. It's strange when you think of it, how we got involved in water sports, coming from Roscrea, about as far away from the sea as you can get.
Yeah.
And we got involved with Limerick Canoeing Club. But, like, at that time, I would have been quite happy to play tennis, play golf. But I remember playing with you on the tennis court one day, and if I hit the ball too hard, you got vexed. And then if I hit it too slow, you said I wasn't really trying. And at the canoeing, you became very efficient at it within a few weeks. And you remember the first episode down in Limerick, I'll never forget it. You came home tired on a Sunday evening and your chin was split open. It needed to be stitched. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And we had an almighty row. You wouldn't let me touch you. And I had to call a colleague to come and stitch you. But the canoeing around the Limerick, all those places, I mean, I was a champion swimmer. Immediately, if you got in towards the eddy at the edge of the river, so I'd turn upside down, and I wasn't able to do the Eskimo roll, and it was a disaster.
Yeah.
I can still feel that cold water around Limerick in the middle of winter touching my body. But once you got over that, then it acted as an insulator, so it was fine. But the main thing, it was a great family thing. We all were involved in it. And I think you learned on those trips how to be responsible for everybody and wait for everybody and look after everybody if we hit a little bit of white water. you waited and the others waited until everybody came through.
Yeah.
But I think that's where you learned to be responsible if you are now. That's another problem.
Yeah. That's actually a great story. That the first time I was ever kayaking on a river, I probably was 8 or 9, I'm not too sure, but we went down to the Castle Connell, the Shannon River outside Limerick, and I capsized the top of this rapid and went down upside down, and I clipped my chin. And you weren't with us. My mum was there, and she was like, "Oh, I'm not going to the regional now, and A&E will be there all day." So she brought me back up to Roscrea in the car, just putting a bit of a bandage on it, and was like, obviously, sure, her husband was a doctor, like he'd stitch me up, no problem. So I went into you anyway, and because I was a bowel child, like you were trying to get me to still, and I kept on shaking my head to try and avoid getting this needle put into my chin. So you, after about 2 minutes, you lost patience. You gave me 2 Valium and you sent me up to another doctor in town to do it. And I could barely walk. Like, you were an awful hooer for medicating me. Like,
well, you were overtired, and you know what you're like when you're overtired.
Sorry, I thought, George, me giving out to you was something I got into later in life. But based on what you're saying there, I used to always do it. Like, so, yeah, that was a funny story, actually. I'll never forget that one. Like, I could barely walk. I remember going into Dr. Ryan's surgery and I had to have my arm around Libby because it was so drugged out of it. Like, you're an awful messer. So, yeah, she's such an inspiration to me. And, like, I always think of Libby when I'm on the top of a big mountain. I talk to a lot of other people about that feeling and what it's like to top out in a massive mountain. And she always comes into my mind because she was such an inspiration for me and for all of us. And she really got you guys into international trekking. I remember you, like, when we got a little bit older, we were still like kind of, I don't know, whatever, 10, 12. You guys did an overseas trek every year or two. So you went like to Morocco, Spain, Majorca, Scotland. You did the Tour de Mont Blanc in the Alps. And she took you up Killy in 1995, George. There's a very famous story there. It's funny, like, because you're the medical director of Earth's Edge now, and the businesses were one of the best companies in the world and the safest for sure. But like, when yourself and Libby did Killy in 1995, you went up the 5-day hut route, which, like, I'll openly say to people now, do not go that way because there's not enough time to acclimatise. But there's a famous story about you managing to get up to Gilliman's Point, which is on the actual crater rim, but you were so bollocks you lay down on the ground and refused to move. Can you remember that? Yeah,
I can't remember it. I was absolutely knackered. I was sick in the stomach, my face was green, and I had no energy in my legs, and I just said, I'm not going any further.
Yeah.
The other thing I remember, coming down, the skiing on the shale on the way down.
On the scree, yeah.
We were used to walking in Morocco and Majorca and England and Scotland. So we had no idea what Kilimanjaro was like, or acclimatization or any of that.
Yeah.
Probably had all the wrong gear on us as well.
I think that the 5-day route alone would stop you, even if you've done a lot of training. It's very tough. It
didn't stop Libby going the whole way.
Yeah. She was tough, like, in fairness, in the hills herself.
She wouldn't give in to it.
It's funny, someone telling you you've about an hour to go from Gilliman's Point. Like, it's a solid 2 hours, especially if you're tired, so that's actually interesting. I want to talk to you about Libby and her story of how she passed away. So I started Earth's Edge in 2007. It was called Into India there. I was running trips all over the Indian Himalayas. Started when I was 24. And she was such a help to me. She used to answer the emails when I go away on trips. I was leading all the expeditions, bar 1 or 2. And she actually went hiking in Sikkim in northern India in October 2008. I was on a trek over a 5,000 meter pass called the Gotiala Pass. It's a really nice trek. And she started developing back issues. And a little bit later that year, we found out that she got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. What was it like getting that news? Can you remember that?
Well, I can remember it very well. It was an awful shock. I mean, she was only 58 at the time.
Yeah.
She had it in her bones, in her glands, her liver, her brain, everywhere. I really felt guilty. I was saying to myself, how did I live with her and not notice anything? But the only complaint she has was pain in her back.
Yeah.
And she was climbing high mountains. And remember speaking to our own GP here in the town. We were wondering what was wrong with her, because even though she had back pain, she had no signs of a disc or anything. But sure, look at nobody's fault again. She was diagnosed, but she was so positive about it.
Yeah.
The only good thing about cancer, James, is that you have a very good idea how long someone is going to live.
Yeah.
That made it a bit easier, because I remember we went up to Dublin and the consultant and his registrar talked to us. And in general, and I excused myself from Libby and I went back into him and I said to them, look, I want to know the story. Talk to me, doctor to doctor. I think she's going to live 3 or 4 months. And they said the very outside 2 years. So she lived 13 months.
Yeah.
Now, she was very positive. She never looked at it negatively. She never blamed anybody. She was positive. She never lost weight. She looked terrific. She got a wig. She looked fabulous right up until the time she died, even though she had failed 4 kinds of chemotherapy.
Yeah, for sure. She was tough. Like, just to kind of put that in context, what you were saying there, you were saying that like cancer, it's horrible and all that, but you get a bit of time to say goodbye to someone as opposed to a heart attack or an accident. It's never easy, like, but
No.
Do you know what makes me smile all the time is like when I started in 2007, like she went on a trip every year. I think she went to India twice the first year, and she was so excited like that this is what we were doing, and she was very supportive of me starting the business, even though I hadn't a clue what I was doing at the start. I was so young, like. But it always makes me smile to think that like she really wanted to go to a trip every year. You weren't really that arsed, and then as it turns out, as we started like working with expedition doctors and I had a role for you in the business, you started going on a trip every year, and it would have absolutely killed her, like, because I've been like, look, no, George is coming, but because he's a doctor, like, no, we don't need a family therapist. You're not coming, It would have been hilarious. Like, I would have gone mad. But she was a great woman, like, and may she rest in peace.
Yeah, I remembered it well, because I was wondering to myself, God, once she died, like, what kind of holidays am I going to have on my own in future?
Yeah.
And your business was starting off, and you needed a doctor on your trip. So really, it suited me, even though I think I was 65 at the time by this time it started.
Yeah, you were, yeah. So, George, that was deadly. Like, thanks a million. We're going to take a little break there, and we're going to come back again next week, lads, to tell you part 2 of George's story, where we share stories about adventures while he and I are working together at Earth's Edge, including the famous story where you got lost in Malawi. That's going to come up, and I've got another few good ones as well. So, guys, stay tuned in, and we'll chat to you next week. Thanks a million, George. That was great.
Right, James. Thanks a million.
This podcast was produced by Earth's Edge. We're a small business based in Ireland who organise big adventures all over the world. For more information about us and the trips discussed on this podcast, visit earths-edge.com or follow us on Instagram. Don't forget to sign up to our mailing list to be in the running to win one of our summit jackets. There's a link in the show notes. And while you're there, if you could subscribe and review the podcast, that'd be brilliant. I'm your host, James McManus. Thanks for listening and have a super week.